Hello, and welcome back to the channel. So in this session, what we're going to do is we're going to look at network policies. So if you go back to the GitHub repository here, go into series 2 and go down to 2.2.1 for network policies. You can see that we have the notes here for studying our network policies. Now, there's a bit of kind of reading with network policies and there's a little bit of kind of studying before you jump into the actual questions themselves. But really what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a Kubernetes cluster here to make sure that I can test my network policies, and you can read through those notes. But really I'm going to come down to question 1 here, which is a basic network policy. So what it basically means is it's a way to stop and allow traffic coming from certain pods, um, because by default all pods are actually able to communicate with one another. So what we want to do is, for extra security, is make sure that we can stop traffic coming in from one pod or multiple pods and only allow certain traffic from different pods. So the first thing I want to do here is I want to go to create an actual namespace. So again, I'm going to use Kubernetes cluster here. I'm going to just reconnect into my cluster here. Okay, so when my cluster is up and running, first thing I want to do is I'm going to create an alias here because it has lost my credentials here. I'm going to create an alias, and I'm going to allow access to this terminal. But I'm going to create my namespace here. So the next thing I'd like to do here is actually create a deployment using the Nginx image with 2 replicas into that namespace. So I'm going to create that. And you can see that my deployment is actually created here. Now, the next thing I want to do is just expose my deployment so that I'm allowed access my deployment from my service. So now I actually have my service exposed here. So now I should be able to say get pods here. And you can see that basically I have 2 pods running, and they're running basically 22 seconds. So what I want to do now is, just as a kind of good practice, it's always good to kind of describe your service and make sure that you can actually output your service using YAML for the exam here. I'm not going to do that right now. I'm just going to kind of continue with the actual questions, because the point is we're going to um, getting quicker into these questions now for the exam purposes. So basically you can see that I've already created my network policy. So I have the full notes here on how to actually kind of create your network policy. And basically what we're doing here is we're picking out a pod and we're matching on the label that basically says anything with app Nginx. So anything with the app Nginx pod is the pod selected that we're basing this network policy on. So what is going to happen here is I'm saying then in my ingress here, I'm going to say, anything from my pod selector that matches access granted. So anything that basically has a label called access granted will be allowed to access my pod. So anything, if we take this as an example, this pod number 1, if this pod basically wants to access this pod, it has to have an actual label um, included. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come out of that, and I'm going to just run my command here, which will also validate my YAML file here. So a nice way to sort of do this, you could also do this if you really kind of wanted to. You can actually just do, your normal kind of create with the file and use your file name. But this is also a nice way to kind of do it using the actual validate. Whether you will actually have time in the exam is depending on your own time, but it definitely helps to kind of run validation on your actual specs as well at the same time. So it just helps in certain scenarios. So let's say now we're going to go back here and we're going to get our net policy. And I can sort of see that the name of my net policy here is the Access Nginx, and the pod selector is app on Nginx, and it's up 40 seconds. So I'm now going to say, if I get pods here, so get the pods for the question. So if I get my pods here in that namespace, and I'm looking for a label called app nginx, so those pods must have that label included. So basically, what I want to do here is I'm going to create a busybox pod here, and I'm going to make sure that it actually runs in interactive mode, which is basically going to say, it's going to delete itself right after, but it's also going to be in the same namespace. And I'm going to send it over this wget command over here, to sort of say, can you actually access this? And I'm going to set a timeout onto this pod. So I'd like to run that back into my namespace here, and you can see here it's not connecting. You can see download timed out. So basically, the pod will terminate with natural errors, so they're saying that it's actually timed out because it does not have that label that we're looking for. So in this access policy here, I've applied a net policy to my pods and to my deployment, and it's basically looking for a label. It's looking for a certain label, which is app equals to nginx. So what I want to do now is I want to verify that my actual the policy is working correctly. And this time I'm going to create another pod here, which is for busybox, and I'm going to do the same scenario, but basically this time I'm going to create a basic label, and I'm going to sort of say access granted, which is what we were basically looking for into our net policy. So we're looking for access granted, and here we're going to sort of say access granted. Now, one thing with network policies that you need to be really, really careful about, especially in the exam, is that, here you can see in your network policy, you've got access colon granted. Okay, so you've got access colon granted. That's how it's actually specified in the network policy. But when you actually describe and get your net policy here, you can basically sort of see that it's actually looking for app equals to nginx. That's just a Kubernetes um, formatting that you just need to be kind of careful of in the actual exam itself. So I'm going to take this command here, and I'm going to go back into my Kubernetes engine cluster here, and this time we're going to basically sort of see that I can see welcome to nginx. So that basically means that I've now actually connected using that busybox 2 temporary pod over to one of my pods here, and basically both pods are running behind a service which has a deployment, but I've connected over to this deployment through the service using that this endpoint here with the port itself specified. So now what I want to do is that I verify this. I want to delete my my network policy here, and I'm going to rerun my command here, which basically still has the label. So I've still created a label, and you can sort of see that still works. So I can sort of see, welcome to nginx. So that actually still works. But if I actually go back in and I'm to rerun my previous command that basically did not have the label. So this command here did not have the label. You remember that the first time it actually timed out. What's going to happen now is that it's actually going to succeed. And the reason it succeeds is basically because we've now removed that network policy. So now we're basically sort of saying, well, now there's nothing to stop any of these pods kind of communicating over to our pod. So that's the kind of first example that I want to kind of go through. So the second one here, if I'm just going to kind of clear the screen quickly, and the second one here basically sort of says, what we're going to do is we're going to do the same type of scenario here, but we're going to do it, a little bit more of a structured example. So What does that basically mean? It basically means that, you know, I'm going to read the question here. It says, you've rolled out one pod. So this is kind of going back to our sample here into your infrastructure, and you need to allow it to communicate with pod 2 and pod 3 and nothing else. So basically we have pod 1, and it should be allowed to communicate with pod 2 and pod 3 and nothing else. Okay, so that's the query. Now, you also have pod 4 that's being created, but it should not be allowed access to pod 1. So basically, it should not be allowed. So pod 4 should not be allowed access to pod 1. Now, again, I'm studying for an exam here, so I'm not designing these as I would in my professional job. I'm not putting the kind of love and attention, if you like, into designing these diagrams, because all I'm trying to do here is highlight um, the inner workings of the actual pod policies here. If I was doing this for real, it would look an awful lot better. But really, all I'm just trying to do is just trying to understand the actual question. So it's kind of like me whiteboarding here, or scribbling onto a piece of paper, what I'm trying to actually design here. So the first thing I want to do here is, I want to sort of make sure that I kind of go back into my cluster here, and I'm going to basically create a new namespace. Now, one thing you can sort of see is I kind of put a hint up here, you know, because network policies, it's all kind of related to labels. It's all kind of based around labels. But I hope that you're actually following a different course about, real good policy, network policy implementation, and how to do them really, in a production environment as well. But again, this is not going to be production level. This is going to be to try and make sure that we pass the exam. So I'm going to sort of say I'm going to run all of those commands here, which is basically just going to create me all of my commands here. So I'm just going to make that a little bit bigger. So it's just a little bit nicer to sort of see. So this question now is kind of the same. It's the same idea. You can describe your pods. You can basically show your labels here. So in the exam, I would basically be running this, and I'm making sure that I can actually sort of see the actual labels. So if they sort of say to me, here's what pods are available, I can just check my labels just quickly. And again, these are just ways to kind of um, verify and make sure that you learn these off by heart on how you're basically going to do that during an exam type scenario, because even in a work scenario, you'd have to be verifying that there's actually labels available. So here I want to sort of say check connections from the new pod. So um, let's sort of say we kind of go back here, and we say, okay, we're going to create a pod, and it's going to be interactive mode here. So I've gone into my shell prompt here, and what I want to do is I want to make sure that this pod 2, pod 3, and pod 4, they should all work basically until I implement my net policy. That's the way it should basically work. So I'm currently setting up um, my scenario here to kind of help me. So what I want to do here is I just want to take pod 2, for example, and I want to paste that. So sorry, I want to take that and I want to put that there. And we know that this Nginx deployment basically runs on port 8080 as the web server. So you can sort of see if I run this now, you can sort of see hello world. This is the version, and the host name is pod 2. And this was a fantastic container image here from Google samples. It says, and it's called Hello App, and it just allows you to kind of check connectivity between these simple pods. But you can sort of see that I've also kind of put out here the information here, and you can kind of do a curl then, you can be verifying all of this your actual self. But the kind of point is, you're going to basically check connections to back to the pod 1. So really, try and diagram this out, try and kind of, so saying, okay, so for, I verified from pod 2 back to to pod 1, and then from pod 1 back to pod 2, and try and kind of diagram it out to sort of say, this is the connection now that I'm kind of checking out. Now again, you're not going to have time in the exam to be drawing these types of diagrams, but just while you're studying, it kind of helps you visualize what you're actually trying to achieve here. So I can sort of say here, check connections back to pod 1. So it's the same idea that we did, um, going from pod 1 out to pod 2, out to pod 3, out to pod 4. And again, all of these basically should work because right now we don't have any network policies, because remember what we said at the start of the video was that, you know, pods by default can all communicate with each other. Okay, so we kind of go back here, and now we're going to actually start to implementing our network policies. So what I want to do here is I want to say, okay, so let's create a network policy to block anything, from or to the app special. Okay, so I want to sort of say here, create a network policy. It's going to be ingress. So this time it's going to be ingress, which basically sort of says, here's the pod selector. Anything that basically has this label, um, it's going to basically only look and only allow for anything that basically has this app label. And basically, you know, this is the one that basically says we're allowed to actually connect to that pod itself. So if I run this now, so I'm just going to exit that, and if I run this command, let's sort of see if I still have that file here. Yes, I do. So I'm just going to come out of that because the file actually exists. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of say validate and run my file here. You can sort of see that the network policy is actually being created. I'm going to come down here and I'm going to do my outbound, my egress here, and you can see I still have the file here from the previous run. And I'm going to come down here and I'm going to sort of say that I should apply it here. You can see that, hello only to chosen. So that's the one, and this is the one that says, hello only from the chosen. This is only to the chosen. Okay, so we're going to come back down here and I'm going to say, okay, I can actually show my labels now, just as a kind of reminder to myself of how I would basically do that. So dash o wide dash show labels. You can sort of see right now I don't actually have any labels apart from the actual default labels that was set up when I ran my initial setup. So I can come back down here and I can basically sort of, I can describe my do network policies or whatever. But one thing what I want to do here is actually now is I want to label my pod 1. So I want to label it. And this is a kind of nice way to actually override the actual labels there, because what we saw here was that there was one label here for pod 1, but what I want to do is I want to label it with a new label for app equals special. And if we go back up here to where our command was here, you could sort of see that, anything with anything with app special is this network policy is basically going to be applied to. So anything with this pod selector and I'm matching on the labels for app special, it's going to be applied to. So basically, because I'm applying it to my first pod, it's going to be applied to that pod. So I'm going to override that label here. You can sort of see that pod 1 has been labeled. I'm going to go back down here and I'm going to, let's say, I'm going to now create a new label on my pod 2 here, which has also been labeled, and then I'm going to also do it on my pod 3 here. And I can sort of see, okay, so my pod 1 has been labeled, my pod 2 has been labeled, and my pod 3 has been labeled. And if I basically rerun my command here, which basically shows all of my labels, you can sort of see that my pod 1 here is labeled, my pod 2 is labeled, and pod 3 is actually labeled with chosen. But pod 4 does not have any label because I don't want to give it access. So because the network policy is looking for app is equal to chosen, and so it's applying it to this, but it's allowing these two. So I don't want to label pod 4 because I don't want it to actually have access. So now I'm going to go back into my new pod again here, which is like my pod 1 here. I'm going to go back in here, and you can sort of see if I now do a wget here, and I need to get the kind of pod 2 IP here. I need to get pod 2. So my pod 2 is this IP. So this is where it gets a little bit strange because you've basically got to think about ingress and egress. So inbound and outbound connections and connectivity to other pods. But essentially what you're doing here is just keep going back to your diagram and try to, as you're studying, try to make sure that you're getting all the connection points correct, and you're trying to understand which is connecting to which and which is meant to be connecting to which. And that will certainly help you kind of learn this an awful lot better. But you can sort of see here, hello world, the pod 2, it definitely worked. And I'm going to come out. Actually, I'm going to just rerun this for a second while I'm here. And I'm going to go to, you can sort of see pod 3 also has the app is equal to chosen. So that also should work. And pod 4, now that doesn't have the actual label. And you can see that basically you get a timeout because that does not actually have the label. So there's nothing that pod 4 basically has on the requirements to be allowed to access. And you could do your netcat here, and you kind of, you basically come back down into your pod 2 here. So you can go back into your pod 2, and then you can kind of recheck your access over to. So I'm in pod 2, and then you could basically come back in here, and you could actually check your access to your pod 1. So you're kind of going back from pod 2 back to pod 1. Does that access work? That's what you're trying to verify here. And you're basically sort of saying, so you're going back to pod 1 IP, which is here, and you just make sure that you have the correct IP here, and you can sort of say, yes, that does work. So, from pod 2 back to pod 1, that access is actually allowed as well because we actually have an ingress and an egress specified. So basically, you know, you could do this for all of the actual connections, but the point of this recording is just to give you a high level overview of network policies. Now, there is a question tree here, and it's the same idea because basically, you can sort of see here, the question tree says configure network policy to allow traffic, to allow pods, and only allow if the actual, label on the pod is app equals to foo, you know, and it's the same type of an idea, and I will leave that up to you to be able to do that, but this will actually work as well. But it's just, again, it's just kind of working through these notes and making sure that you repeat them, try and diagram them out as you're kind of learning them. When you come to the exam, hopefully these type of small diagrams, even the most basic diagrams, you know help you through the exam to understand. I remember, there was a connection from pod 1 to pod 2 and to pod 3, and pod 4 there was no connection. It should not work. Simple diagrams, just really kind of quickly on how to actually study and improve on your speed during the exam. So thank you for watching the session, and I'll see you in the next.